There are two kinds of determinants of longer-term economic growth. The first I call systematic forces, like property rights, competition, etc. The second are shocks. And let me start with shocks. Shocks are events which are usually external to a country, but sometimes are produced by bad policies. There are two kinds of shocks. Positive shocks, for example, the prices of your export are rising, and this is very dangerous, because this is a windfall gain, like in Brazil. This may weaken the incentives to reform. But there are negative shocks, like the one suffered in Spain or in Greece. And the negative shock in itself is bad, but it may be a necessary incentive to reform, depending on the balance of forces. Now, there's a lot of myth, anti-capitalistic myth. It should be unmasked. We have to be on the offensive, not on the defensive. We should not say, I'm sorry for liberalism. We should attack the populists. So they should justify themselves. Now, the first myth, very widespread in the West, is that crisis or negative shocks come only under capitalism. So whenever you said crisis, the leftists say shock, capitalism. What is the truth? The worst crises have occurred under non-market economies, without markets. Stalinism, huge crisis in the 30s, and genocide. Maoism, 50 million people dead, and economic catastrophe. Khmer Rouge, the highest percentage of owned population murdered. Or less drastic, but also economically destructive cases of very irresponsible economic policies which end in high debt and the collapse of the economy. So first, the worst crises are due to excessive concentration of economic, political power and lack of markets. This is the fact. Now, most of anti-capitalistic propaganda comes from the analysis of Great Depression. So they say, look, Great Depression, say, proves that capitalism is bad because it cannot sustain itself. And this has been perpetuated through generation and through many textbooks. Now, if you look at empirical research, it is unmasking this. First, it was reasonably established that it was bad monetary policy, which was a public policy, which produced a breakdown. But then the results of this breakdown were perpetuated by New Deal, which was anti-business. They wanted to increase demand by squeezing profits. So they produced a collapse of investment, and this has been prolonged, plus protectionism. So the lesson from Great Depression is not the free markets fail, but the bad policies fail. And the same goes for the recent crisis. For the populist or statists, every crisis is an opportunity to attack free markets. So they are doing this too. But if you dig more deeply into empirical research, you see that what they say, that markets have failed, that we need more intervention, is completely false on empirical grounds. And this has to be unmasked, because they are very vocal. Well, would we blame Greece? Greece's crisis for free markets? They were consistently voting for their Santa Clauses, and they were spending like crazy, and then what? But they are ultra-Marxists, which now try to govern, to cure. They are quarrel between Maoist, Stalinist, and ecological communists. This is Syriza. And they want to get money to pursue their crazy policies. This is their point. Now, what about more difficult case like Spain or Ireland? Are the markets to blame for the boom which resulted into the bust? I happen to be a member of De La Rosière group, which was a group at the high level at the European Union entrusted with the task to identify the underlying causes of the recent financial crisis And based on empirical research, we came with at least 10 bad interventions, policies. What is the worst intervention? It is state ownership, or politicized ownership. And I think Spain provides a perfect natural experiment. You have a dual banking sector. You have famous cajas, which were politicized regional banks, and you have other banks. Where is the high percentage of problems? In cajas. Why? Because they were politicized. And this only confirms a previous research of the World Bank, which covered 120 countries and came with a strong empirical conclusion that political intervention in the banks bring about disasters. Because politicized loans are usually highly bad loans. What about Landesbanken in Germany? These are regional politicized banks, a similar story. What about Slovenia recently? 70% of the banking sector was in the state-owned. Naturally, lots of bad loans, a collapse of the economy. And so this is one reason, but not the only reason, because there were also lots of bad regulations, which encouraged excessive risk-taking on the parts of the lenders, on the borrowers. There were tax regulations which discourage equity finance and encourage bank lending, etc., etc. So one has to undermine in the public the myth. Which is the myth? That the recent crisis was mostly due to the free market. There were no free markets in finance, especially in the banks. There were distorted markets, too big to fail. It is not a pure market phenomenon. It is a product, too big to fail, is a product of distorted markets when political authorities start to bail out large banks and markets react in a rational way, but with irrational results. Big banks are getting cheaper finance and they are getting even bigger, so we have to unmask this. What about policies in response to the crisis which has been largely provoked by bad policies? Now I come into this expression. Secular stagnation was invented by the Marxists, but has been rediscovered by the Keynesians, especially Mr. Summers. If you read Financial Times, then you see the secular stagnation is the catastrophe. This is Financial Times. So they're buying this, secular stagnation. Now what policies? First, there was, IMF was encouraging fiscal stimulus. And Zapatero government bought it. So first 2 years in Spain was a fiscal stimulus, which makes the situation worse. Greece has also bought IMF advice and stimulated the economy without having already a high public debt. Second, because of the second policy, which is the unconventional monetary policy. This is completely unprecedented in the world history. To have interest rate close to zero for 7 years never happened. To have massive creation of money to buy securities, which de facto means nationalization of financial markets. This is de facto nationalization, because what the financial players are looking at, what the central bank would do, not which companies are better. So this is nationalization. Now this has been presented as a panacea and continues to be presented. And once all the forecasts tend to be bad. So all the reality was even always worse than the official forecasts, even in the United States. So if you compare the strength of recovery in the US to the previous 16 recoveries, you see that even in the US it's very mediocre, not to mention Europe. So what is the response of the proponents of massive money printing and buying at zero? They reinvented secular stagnation. They say, implicitly or explicitly, our policy has been optimal, but something external prevents economy to grow. So they were always in the right. This is unbelievable arrogance, I must say. Unbelievable arrogance on intellectual grounds. Because there is a lot of researchers, starting with BIS, who point out to the negative impacts of this unconventional continued monetary policy on economic growth via weakening the supply side, via slowing down the restructuring, via weakening incentives of the politicians to reform. If you can get cheap money, well, why should you reform? But this continues. And weakens instead of delays the strengthening of the supply side. It is always the supply side which is decisive. So look on the behavior on the private investment, which tells you what the private sector players are doing. Now, this is about the shocks, negative shocks, because I thought and I think that a lot, the myth which had been accumulated regarding the crisis, including the recent crisis, are exceptional, and they have to be unmasked. But I also said that there are some more systematic forces which shape the supply side of the economy. And these systematic forces at the first level, approximate level, are three: employment, investment, which is related to the third force, which is innovation. And there's a lot of empirical research which shows that, and these factors are weak because of bad policies. Employment. OECD studies which show what sort of policies reduce employment, including dual labor markets, like in Spain until recently, Greece, Italy, still in France. So these are bad social policies which produce a lot of social harm, meaning hurting people. They deprive people of the prospect of bad life because there is no good life without a job. But this is not a product, the lack of jobs is not a product of free market capitalism within the framework of the rule of law. It is a product of bad policies, which are so popular, and they have to be unmasked. Investment. If your public investment cannot be substituted, private investment, sorry, cannot be substituted with private investment. Private investment is indispensable. Under socialists, all investment was only public, and you had a catastrophe. So I think the Juncker plan is not a panacea. It tries to replace private investment with a public investment. Right? In Poland, we have an epoch in the 70s. Our first secretary wanted to modernize Polish economy. His name was Gierek, you don't know. He was a benefactor, so Juncker plan is almost like a Gierek plan. Gierek plan. So public investment is a panacea. In every political system, you have a lot of political interventions whenever investment are public. Caucasus is one example, etc. This pyramids started with pyramids. Pyramids were the first ancient public investment, and this continues. So one has to remove obstacles to private investment, and this is largely policy-created uncertainty. You would know what the central bank are doing. What about regulations? What about structural reforms, which are to some extent crowded out by cheap money policies, and rationally enough private investment are largely going on strike. And this cannot be compensated by any public investment. On innovations, which is the most important growth factor, we know a lot. First of all, if your investment ratio is very low, you cannot be very innovative because some innovation require investment. So policies which reduce investment, private investment to very low level, also reduce innovations. But there have been cases when investment ratio was high, but innovativeness was low. Why? The first case was socialism. In some countries, investment ratio was very high. Lots of wasteful investment. What was lacking? Competition. There is no innovativeness without strong competition in education sector and in the economy. So whenever there is no competition, you can invest a lot and you would have mediocre results. Then if you have small countries which are protectionist, like Portugal under Salazar, or Greece, until now, they have a very low trade ratio to GDP, you don't have competition, you are not innovative, you are not growing. And finally, the guilds. The guilds, you remember, yes? You have these were cartels. Until they existed, there was not much innovation. They have to be broken. So, and I think these are some of the most important factors on the shock side and on as far as systematic forces. Because let me end with a basic Leninist question. What to do? You alluded to that. You know, in every society, in United States, in Spain, in Poland, France, Germany, there will always be statist forces, those who demand more state intervention. They regard the state, or they pretend to regard the state, as a deity, God. There are two groups within this camp. First, those who want to get more money, or more protection, which can be translated into money. Those who want to defend their privileges. I just heard that here in Spain, all the foreign films are on dubbing, yes? So you can't learn English while you listen to TV, because there is a cartel of actors who is doing. That's amazing. This has to be broken. Okay, so interest groups are defending their privileges. But there are also ideological statists. Now, those who hate free markets and worship big government, not because of commercial motivation, but uncommercial. There are many Marxists. One can think it is amazing that after catastrophe, human and economic catastrophe of socialism, which was based on Marxism, there would be so many followers. But they are. You know, in social sciences, you can be wrong on everything and to be regarded as a prophet. Why? If you invent a scheme of interpretation of society which evokes strong emotions, you have to show the paradise. And the paradise is communism. You have to define the devil. The devil is bourgeoisie. And exploit. Why it is the devil? Because bourgeoisie, by definition, exploits better people who are called proletariat, employees. And this is a powerful, you have to just to produce hate so that people feel better. They hate and they feel better. So they defend the oppressed by definition, and they try to attack the bad people, and this works wonders. And this has to be unmasked, because of course it is completely false. It presents a society in a market system as a zero-sum game. So you are poor because some other people are rich, and this is called exploitation. It's nothing to do with any evidence, lots to do with hatred, produced hatred, and it can be very, very effective. And this is why we have to be better on communication. And I think our communication has to be offensive, has to be based on research, which is a lot, but the results of research has to be sold much better. We should not excuse ourselves for defending economic freedom within the rule of law. We should unmask people who hurt society in the name of public good, being socialist or unsocialist, whatever, collectivists. And I think such arrangements like this are one of the means to mobilize. I call it freedom fighters. We should be more effective freedom fighters within our respective societies. Thank you very much.
We need economic growth. And in my home country, Austria, we keep telling ourselves, slapping ourselves on the shoulder, oh, we are good. Our numbers are okay. We are now average. We are within the median of anything. I don't want to be average. We have to compete with the best and have to look at the best figures and numbers around the world and have to take their examples. So this is another reason why we also need economic growth and why we need to compete with the best. And because without growth, it is still stand, and the others who know exactly what competition means will overtake us. And this is what Austria, my home country, has seen in all international rankings. We are falling back, unfortunately, because our government simply does not do the right things. And now I would cover, I would say, 10 points that bring us back to economic growth and to robust recovery. And they are not only true for Austria, they are true for all over Europe, and Leszek has done them very successfully in his home country, at least many of them, but we have forgotten them. And I think the first and foremost is to respect the rule of law. I just give you two examples. Austria, and you can see this in many other countries too. Austria had a very good taxation for international corporations, for headquarters. The recent government, or the current government, all of a sudden changed this legislation, but for the past years as well. So there are no incentives anymore for international corporations to come here to Austria and invest their money and create jobs. One thing, if we look at the EU level, there is no respect of the rule of law. If we look at what has happened with the European Stability Mechanism and the consequences thereof, or just give you the example of the Maastricht criteria, we have broken all the rules and regulations and laws that we have created ourselves. So there is no reason that we as Europeans have to smash others. We have to look at ourselves. Second point is sound money. And I just give you the QE that you have already pointed out, that Juncker is currently, or actually the ECB with the help of Juncker and his friends, is currently doing. Another point that always has helped countries to become more successful, and I just give you the Singaporean example. When Lee Kuan Yew started 40 years, or 50 years actually this year ago, he did four things. One thing is respect the rule of law. Second thing is create the right incentives for businesses, have limited taxation, very small, interesting taxation, fight corruption, and have little bureaucracy. So those four things are a precondition. And I don't see any countries, at least any big countries in Europe, that look into smart, small, fair, flat taxes. It can be done. We have seen that. Even a social democratic government has put a 10% flat tax into option, and it worked until the so-called financial crisis hit Bulgaria, and they rose the taxes, but it's still a flat tax. Another thing, our European, I would say, leadership or establishment talks about smart regulation. I don't think we're smart regulated. We are over-regulated, and the businesses are the ones who suffer. Just two little examples. What about if we go to the shops and buy food? If we look at the new regulation, what has to be put on this, have we starved, or have we lived worse 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago without this new regulation? I don't think so. It's just one, but there are many others. Efficient governments, another very important point, nowhere to be seen. Free trade, I only want to remind you of the TTIP discussion that we are currently leading, which is also one of those fails discussions, because wrong arguments are being put out in favor or against it, and we don't really look into the real matter, why free trade is important and why we need to have those trade agreements. And after all, individual choice and the protection of property rights. I think the protection of our property rights, and especially intellectual property rights, this is something that we really need to have a close look if we want to foster entrepreneurship and get out of this mess and have more innovation in our countries, because after all, innovation is also a driver. And finally, entrepreneurship. I mean, how can we support entrepreneurship? It cannot be supported by governments. If governments let the enterprises alone, then they can work. And I think this is the most important message that we have to give. So provide the right incentives for business people to invest, to take the risk, and who, because those guys also stand up for what if they make a mistake. Many banks don't, and the people who run them as well, so they get away with it. And this is a big difference. And we were discussing earlier why Austria is, for example, still surviving or doing that good, because we have a strong Mittelstand. We have the small and medium-sized enterprises that pay their taxes, that take the risks, that employ people, and these are the things. And the last point, and then I'm done, is we need to have brave politicians. Brave politicians who stand up, do their homework, and are not afraid of telling their voters, you know what, it will hurt right now, but structural reforms are a precondition, and they are a precondition for entire Europe, no matter whether it's Germany, whether it's Austria, whether it's Spain, whether it's Greece. So I'll leave it with that, and I hope that we get away from this so-called illusion of growth, but get to our real vision, the bigger picture for Europe. Thank you.
Bona nit. That's all the Catalan I know, so I will speak in English, even though I also speak Castilian. So I want to tell you some of the things I do also as a son of a Spanish parents. My father from Madrid, my mother from Segovia, but they left Spain during the Franco dictatorship, and I was born and grew up in Venezuela, where now we have a terrible populist government, socialist government, who has been advised by people in Podemos, as you probably know. So that is why I'm so concerned about Spain, because I have the experience of the terrible consequences of people like Podemos in power. As a Venezuelan, I represent the Millennium Project, and also I work in a new university in California. The Millennium Project began as the futuristic part of the United Nations university, but now it is an independent NGO, and we have many futurists from around the planet collaborating with us. One of them is my friend here, Jordi, behind, and we work on the issues about the future and comparisons. Also, in terms of economic freedom, there is another group that compares how free countries are, and you can see, for example, the freer you are blue, and the less free you are repressed, you are red. So sadly, as you can see, Venezuela is with Cuba, is with Libya, with Iran, with Belarus, North Korea, all those non-free nations. So I can tell you about the results of this populism, which is supported by Podemos, okay? And Izquierda Unida and some other parties. But there is a clear economic correlation between freedom and economic development. The freer a country is, the more wealth there is in the country, and the more repressed you are, the less wealth there is in a country. So this is a fundamental concept that we try to express with our free market ideas. Also, if we look at communist countries between 1950 and 1990, I don't know if you can see it well, but basically these are comparisons between communist countries and capitalist countries. One of the most famous examples, obviously, is Germany between 1950 and 1990. East Germany, that was the most successful communist country ever, and that's because the Germans are very hardworking under any system. You know, they were much poorer than the capitalist West Germans. The situation was much worse between Austria and Hungary as parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hungary, as you know, became more or less communist, and Austria was more open market. So basically, the difference was also big between these two cousins. The same between China and Taiwan before China began opening its markets, or between North and South Korea, or between Tanzania and Kenya, while they are brothers also, but Tanzania is more communist and Kenya is more open markets, or between Cuba and Puerto Rico. Similar islands in the Caribbean, but one is communist, another one is free market. So I think that the evidence is very clear. There is no communist country, populist country that was ever successful, not even East Germany, which was the most hardworking communist country in history. But talking about growth, I want to tell you what the growth will come from in the future. And 5 years ago, a new institution was created in Silicon Valley to talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, and growth. I am one of the founding faculty of this university. We have one of our first Catalan students here. Jordi, if you want to stand up so that they talk to you. So we have had now several students from Catalonia, from other parts of Spain, and from all over the planet. For the students here, let me tell you, now our summer program is completely free because we got an endowment by Google of $3 million to cover the cost for the summer program this year now and next year. So our parents are basically Google and NASA. So I think I don't have to introduce Google and NASA. But we talk about innovation, about technology, about entrepreneurship. And this is what we try to teach to our students. The idea was popularized by an engineer from my alma mater, MIT, Ray Kurzweil. And Ray Kurzweil, 10 years ago, he wrote this very famous book, The Singularity is Near, that is recommended by Bill Gates as the best book about the future of humanity. And he talks what is going to happen throughout this century. And basically, in terms of computing power, if we follow Moore's law, during the next 20 to 30 years, we will have computers that are as powerful as the human brain. And that is actually called the technological singularity. When we have artificial intelligence that reaches human intelligence level, we estimate that this is going to happen between 2029 and 2045, depending on the speed of Moore's law. I want to show this to you because there are some young people who have never seen this. This was used for computers when we studied, 30 years ago. These are called the IBM punch cards. This basically has 10 rows times 100 columns, which is 1,000K. 1,000 bits, this is 1K. But this was substituted by better memories, electromagnetic memories that you could erase. But this was also 1K 30 years ago. I used this 30 years ago. So 1K mechanical and 1K electromagnetic. In Spanish, we say un K y un K is two Ks? No, is one caca. One caca. We had one caca of memory 30 years ago. And you know how this has been evolving. Obviously, we went from this to this to this. And now we have pen drives, which are incredible. I also work in Japan and Korea, leaders in this type of memories. This has 128 gigabytes. 128 gigabytes. This is basically a computer. Look what has happened in 30 years. What do you think will happen in the next 30 years? In the 30 years, you will remember me, and you will remember caca. But this will be caca in 30 years. I will have a smaller device that has more transistors than you have neurons in your brain. And that will be the beginning of the technological singularity. This is happening in all areas, not just in computers. Let me show this also with the human genome. I sequenced my genome 6 years ago with a little device called a gene chip. It's a chip to sequence the genome. So I will show you my genome, which is in internet. My whole genome is in internet. This is the partial sequence so that you do not know everything about me. Like the diseases I will have. What is the probability that I will have cancer, that I will have diabetes, and other things I don't want to show, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and so on. Once you sequence your genome, and all of you will do it in the next 5 to 10 years, you will know what you will die of. But so that you do not know, you don't die of that, because in the future, medicine will no longer be curative. Medicine will be preventive in the next 10 years, thanks to devices like this. But you will also learn where your family comes from. And this is my paternal line 500 years ago. You can see where my father comes from Spain, all the way to Asia and to Mongolia. And you will correlate your family with famous people. Like in my case, you see, I am related to Genghis Khan. So no one fight here with me. This is on my father's side. Now I will show you my mother's side. My mother's side also, she comes from Spain, France, all the way to Siberia, and she's related to Marie Antoinette. I come from a very aristocratic family between Marie Antoinette and Genghis Khan. All of you will know where you come from once you sequence your genome in the next 5 to 10 years, and you will be able to retrace your genealogical tree and verify for the first time if your father is really your father. But more interesting than looking into the past is looking into the future. And we will design our children in the next few years. This is an experiment I did with one of my students, combining genes. We combine genes. Obviously, this is a theoretical experiment, to know how our children could be and then select the genes that you want. You might think that this is expensive, right? This was incredibly expensive 10 years ago. When the first Human Genome Project was finished in 2003, after 13 years, it began in 1990 until 2003, it cost over $1 billion. Today, in 2015, you do it for less than $1,000 in 5 days. And we estimate that in 10 years, you are going to sequence your genome for $10 in 1 minute. All of you will sequence your genome, and you will know what you will die of so that you do not die of that. In fact, Google created a new company to cure aging. We believe that in 20 to 30 years, we are going to see the death of death. We will kill death. We will be able to cure the aging process in the next 20 to 30 years. In fact, you might have seen this. It was the cover article in Time magazine. I have one of my students working in this project. We are going to cure the aging process in the next 20 and 30 years if we have free markets. And this is the important condition, if we have free markets. Because the populists and the socialists will say, no, we cannot have this unless everybody has it at the same time. And obviously, there will be some people who will be immortal first than others. But anyway, so I just want to close up with this very famous picture of the world at night by NASA, because Singularity University is located at NASA in Silicon Valley. And you can look at the world at night. And I also mentioned I teach in Korea. I want you to see a close-up of Korea, because there are two Koreas. There is South Korea, which is a rich, wealthy, open country, free markets, capitalist. And then there is North Korea, one of the poorest countries in the world, where there is no electricity, where there is no internet. North Korea is the last country in the world without internet, the last country in the planet. While South Korea has the best internet in all of Asia. So this is the decision we have to take. Do you want to go the way of North Korea and Podemos? Or do you want to go the way of free markets and capitalism and the future? So I finished with this Chinese word. I lived 3 years in Tokyo. I had to learn some Chinese. Chinese is very complicated, and it took me time to draw it right. Sometimes I did it upside down, sideways, backwards. Now I know this is how you write the word crisis in Chinese. In Chinese, and in Japanese, and in Korean, and in Vietnamese, crisis has two characters. The first character means danger, but the second one means opportunity. So we are in the middle of a big crisis. We have a big danger, but we have a fantastic opportunity. So thank you very much.